You are sitting in a hospital hallway, staring at a vending machine because looking anywhere else hurts too much. A few minutes ago, someone told you that everything would be all right. They said there was a reason for this. They said God has a plan. You nodded because it felt cruel to argue with someone who was trying to comfort you, but the moment they walked away, one question refused to leave your mind. What if the hardest questions are the ones that no simple answer was ever meant to solve? Most people have experienced a moment like this, even if the details were different. Maybe it was not a hospital. Maybe it was a funeral, an empty apartment after someone left, a phone call that changed everything, or the silence that followed years of praying for something that never happened. There are moments when every confident answer suddenly feels too small for the weight of reality, not because faith disappears and not because disbelief suddenly wins, but because human suffering has a way of exposing questions that refuse to fit inside neat explanations. One of those questions is surprisingly simple. If an all-powerful and loving God exists, why does reality so often feel impossible to understand? That question has inspired philosophers, theologians, skeptics, and ordinary people for thousands of years. It has never produced a single answer that satisfies everyone. Perhaps that is exactly why it refuses to disappear. Notice what usually happens when someone asks this question. Some people immediately defend their beliefs. Others immediately reject them. Very few people stay in the uncomfortable middle long enough to admit that uncertainty itself might have something important to teach us. We often rush toward certainty because uncertainty feels dangerous. It feels like standing on a bridge whose supports have suddenly become invisible. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever prayed with complete sincerity and still watched the outcome go in the opposite direction? Or perhaps you never prayed at all, yet you still found yourself asking why terrible things happen to decent people, while cruelty sometimes seems to flourish without consequence. Whether you are deeply religious, quietly skeptical, or somewhere between the two, chances are this question has crossed your mind at least once. If it has, share your perspective below. Not because there is a prize for finding the perfect answer, but because every honest experience adds another piece to a conversation that humanity has been having for centuries. There is another reason this question feels so personal. It threatens more than our beliefs. It threatens our sense of control. Human beings naturally search for patterns because patterns make the world feel safer. We want to believe that good choices always produce good outcomes, that kindness is always rewarded, and that suffering always serves an understandable purpose. Sometimes life seems to support those hopes, other times it tears them apart without warning. That tension creates an uncomfortable psychological conflict. When reality refuses to match our expectations, we usually respond in one of three ways. We change our interpretation of reality, we change our beliefs, or we learn to live with questions that may never receive complete answers. None of those paths is easy. Each demands a different kind of courage. Imagine two people standing in the exact same storm. One sees evidence that God has abandoned the world. The other sees an opportunity to trust more deeply than ever before. The storm itself has not changed. Only the interpretation has. That observation does not prove either person right or wrong. It simply reminds us that human beings never experience reality without filtering it through memory, hope, fear, culture, and expectation. Perhaps that is what makes this discussion so emotionally difficult. We are rarely arguing only about ideas. We are also protecting the experiences that shaped us. A person who found hope through faith during unimaginable pain may hear criticism as an attack on the very thing that helped them survive. A person who experienced unanswered prayers during devastating loss may hear confident religious answers as a dismissal of genuine suffering. Both reactions are deeply human. That is why this conversation cannot begin with winning an argument. It has to begin with understanding why the argument exists in the first place. As we continue, the goal is not to prove or disprove God. It is to examine why certain questions continue to echo across generations, why intelligent and compassionate people arrive at profoundly different conclusions, and what those differences reveal about the human search for meaning when certainty seems just out of reach, because the question that keeps people awake at night is often not whether God exists. It is whether we can continue searching for meaning when the answers remain painfully incomplete. The longer you sit with that uncertainty, the more you begin to notice something unexpected. The question itself starts changing you. At first you believe you are searching for an explanation about God. Then, almost without realizing it, you discover that you are also searching for an explanation about yourself. Why do you need certainty so badly? Why does ambiguity feel almost unbearable? Why does one unanswered question have the power to shake years of confidence? Perhaps the deepest mystery is not simply the silence we perceive from heaven, but the noise inside our own minds whenever certainty slips away. Human beings are remarkable storytellers. We create narratives to connect random events, to transform suffering into purpose, to convince ourselves that tomorrow will somehow justify today. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. In many ways, it is what allows people to survive extraordinary hardship. Yet every story eventually reaches a chapter where reality refuses to cooperate. A child dies too young. A devoted parent develops a devastating illness. A generous person loses everything, while someone driven by cruelty appears to prosper. These moments do not automatically destroy belief, nor do they automatically validate disbelief. What they do is expose how fragile every human explanation can become when confronted with the full complexity of existence. That realization can be frightening because most of us quietly assume that if we collect enough information, we will eventually eliminate uncertainty. We approach life almost like solving a puzzle. Study harder, think more clearly, ask better questions, and eventually every missing piece will fall into place. But what if existence is not a puzzle designed to be completed? What if some questions remain open, not because human beings have failed, but because reality itself exceeds the limits of our understanding? That possibility frustrates many people because it denies the comforting promise of complete intellectual control. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that certainty has often been temporary. Ideas once defended with absolute confidence were later abandoned. Scientific models evolved, philosophical systems changed, religious interpretations developed over centuries. Even our personal beliefs transform as our lives unfold. Think about the person you were 10 years ago. Chances are you interpreted the world differently. Experiences that seemed impossible then may now feel obvious. Convictions that once appeared unshakable may have softened, not necessarily because they were false, but because life introduced perspectives you had never anticipated. There is a quiet humility in recognizing that growth often begins where certainty ends. Consider a memory that still lingers in your mind. Perhaps there was a night when you desperately wanted an answer. You replayed every conversation, every decision, every mistake. You asked why things happened the way they did. You expected clarity to arrive like a sudden flash of light. Instead, nothing happened. The next morning looked exactly like the previous one. The questions remained. Yet months later, perhaps years later, you realized that the experience had changed you, even though the answer never came. You became more compassionate toward other people carrying invisible burdens. You became slower to judge. You became less eager to speak with absolute confidence about experiences you had never lived yourself. In that sense, unanswered questions sometimes accomplish something that immediate answers never could. They reshape character. They expand empathy. They remind us how little we truly know about another person's inner world. If you have ever lived through a season where every explanation felt insufficient, share that experience below. Not because anyone else can solve it for you, but because honest stories often reveal that uncertainty is far more universal than we imagine. There is another psychological pattern worth noticing. When people encounter profound uncertainty, they often move toward extremes. Some cling more tightly than ever to certainty because doubt feels dangerous. Others reject every previous belief because disappointment feels like betrayal. Both responses are understandable. Yet there is a quieter path that receives far less attention. It is the willingness to continue asking difficult questions without assuming that every question must produce an immediate verdict. That path demands patience in a culture that rewards instant conclusions. It asks us to distinguish between confidence and certainty, between curiosity and cynicism, between humility and surrender. None of those distinctions are easy because they require us to admit that our emotional needs often shape our intellectual conclusions. We do not merely believe ideas because they appear convincing. We also believe them because they comfort us, challenge us, protect us, inspire us, or help us endure pain. Recognizing that does not invalidate belief or skepticism. It simply reminds us that human beings are never purely rational creatures. Every worldview is carried by a person with memories, fears, hopes, disappointments, relationships, and dreams. That is why conversations about God so often become emotional. Beneath every argument lies a personal story. Somewhere behind every confident declaration is a moment that made that confidence feel necessary. Somewhere behind every doubt is an experience that refused to fit inside familiar explanations. When we forget those stories, discussions become contests. When we remember them, discussions become opportunities to understand one another more deeply. And perhaps that is where the most unsettling realization begins to emerge. The question that first sounded like an accusation slowly transforms into something else entirely. Instead of asking why reality refuses to match our expectations, we begin asking whether our expectations were ever capable of containing reality in the first place. That shift does not eliminate pain. It does not erase grief. It does not magically answer the oldest philosophical questions, but it changes the posture from which we ask them. Instead of demanding that existence conform to our preferred narrative, we become willing to explore the possibility that the human search for meaning is itself part of what makes us profoundly human. The next step in that journey leads to an even more uncomfortable realization, because the greatest challenge may not be explaining suffering, silence, or uncertainty. It may be confronting the stories we tell ourselves whenever we cannot bear not knowing. There comes a moment when you stop asking whether the universe owes you an explanation and begin asking why you expected one in the first place. That question is far more unsettling because it turns the spotlight away from heaven and places it directly on the human heart. From childhood, most of us are taught that every story has a conclusion, every mystery has an answer, and every struggle eventually makes sense. We grow up believing that if we are patient enough, intelligent enough, faithful enough, or determined enough, life will eventually reveal the missing piece that makes everything coherent. Then reality interrupts that expectation. A loved one dies without warning. A dream collapses after years of sacrifice. Someone who spent decades trying to do everything right watches another person who ignored every moral principle succeed beyond imagination. None of these experiences automatically prove anything about God, nor do they disprove anything. What they do reveal is how desperately the human mind searches for order, even when reality refuses to provide it. We often underestimate how uncomfortable uncertainty truly is. Psychologists have long observed that people frequently prefer an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. The mind has an extraordinary ability to construct narratives because narratives reduce anxiety. They allow us to believe that events are connected, that suffering serves a purpose, or that injustice will eventually be balanced. Those stories can become sources of tremendous resilience. They can also become limitations when we begin confusing our interpretations with reality itself. The difficult truth is that every human being, regardless of belief, lives with assumptions that cannot be completely verified. Some trust in a divine purpose they cannot fully see. Others trust that natural processes alone are sufficient to explain existence. Both positions require stepping beyond complete certainty because no one possesses absolute knowledge of every dimension of reality. Recognizing that does not erase disagreement, but it should cultivate humility. Humility is often mistaken for weakness, yet it may be one of the strongest intellectual virtues a person can possess. It allows someone to say that they believe something deeply while acknowledging that their understanding remains incomplete. It creates room for curiosity instead of fear. It replaces the pressure to win every argument with the desire to understand why intelligent people can sincerely arrive at different conclusions. Imagine two strangers sitting on opposite sides of the same train. One silently thanks God for surviving a terrible accident years ago. The other silently concludes that survival was nothing more than chance because someone they loved never came home from a similar accident. Neither person knows the story unfolding inside the other. If they began debating immediately, they would probably exchange arguments. If they began by exchanging experiences, they might discover something far more valuable. They would see that beneath every worldview is a human being trying to make sense of joy, grief, hope, disappointment, and mortality. Perhaps that is why conversations about ultimate questions become so emotionally charged. They are rarely only about ideas. They are about identity. They are about the memories that shaped us. They are about the people we lost, the prayers we whispered, the nights we spent awake wondering whether anyone was listening, and the mornings we somehow found the strength to continue anyway. When someone challenges a deeply held belief, it can feel as though they are challenging the story that carried us through our darkest moments. Likewise, when someone dismisses another person's doubts, they may unintentionally dismiss years of genuine pain and unanswered questions. Neither response builds understanding. Both reveal how vulnerable human beings become whenever the foundations of meaning are questioned. If you have followed this journey to this point, perhaps you have noticed something unexpected. The title promised a question that seemed directed toward God. Yet much of the journey has quietly revealed questions directed toward ourselves. That is because the deepest philosophical questions often function like mirrors. They reflect our fears, our desires, our assumptions, and our need for certainty. Whether one ultimately embraces faith, skepticism, or something between the two, that mirror remains. It asks whether we are willing to admit the limits of our own perspective. It asks whether we can remain compassionate toward people whose conclusions differ from ours. It asks whether certainty is always the highest goal, or whether wisdom sometimes begins with the courage to say that we do not know. This does not mean abandoning conviction. Convictions matter. They shape lives, inspire sacrifice, motivate compassion, and provide direction. But conviction without humility can become brittle. The moment it encounters a question it cannot answer, it risks collapsing into fear or hostility. Humility, by contrast, allows conviction to coexist with curiosity. It permits us to continue seeking truth without pretending we have already exhausted it. In the end, perhaps the most important realization is not that one side has defeated the other. It is that the human search for meaning is itself evidence of something profound about our nature. We are creatures who refuse to stop asking why. We search for purpose in suffering, beauty in chaos, justice in an imperfect world, and hope in the face of mortality. That search has produced religions, philosophies, scientific discoveries, works of art, and acts of extraordinary compassion. It has also produced disagreements that may never be fully resolved. Yet perhaps the value of the search does not depend entirely on reaching a final answer. Perhaps it also lies in what the search transforms us into along the way. The person who continues asking honest questions without losing compassion, who continues listening without surrendering integrity, and who continues seeking meaning without claiming absolute certainty, may discover something unexpected. Not necessarily the answer they wanted, but a deeper appreciation for the complexity of existence and the shared humanity of everyone, asking the same timeless questions from different directions. The mystery may remain, the uncertainty may never completely disappear. But if this journey has accomplished anything, it is a reminder that some of the most important conversations are not those that end with universal agreement. They are the ones that leave us more thoughtful, more humble, and more willing to see another person not as an opponent to defeat, but as a fellow traveler trying to understand a reality that is far greater than any single explanation can fully contain.